The 11th of July, 1943. Behind the dunes at Gela, on the southern coast of Sicily, a young American artillery officer is doing arithmetic he does not have time to finish. In front of him, close enough now that he can hear the engines over the surf, German tanks are coming down the coastal plain toward the water, not toward a defensive line. There is barely a defensive line worth the name. Toward the sea itself, toward the landing craft and the supply dumps, and the men still waiting ashore with their rifles held over their heads. The Hermann Göring Division has been told the invasion can be shoved back into the Mediterranean before it takes root. And on this particular morning, that prediction looks like it might come true. There is a verdict riding behind those tanks, and it is older than the invasion. It was written in the mountains of Tunisia 4 months earlier, in the considered professional opinion of an army that had just taken a green United States Corps apart at a pass called Kasserine. The verdict said the American soldier fought a rich man's war from a safe distance, that he had more trucks than sense, and more shells than experience, and that the moment you closed the range and put steel in his face, he would come apart. The men driving on Gela believed it. Their commander believed it. Berlin believed it. And for roughly a day and a half, that stretch of Sicilian beach was the exact spot on Earth where the belief would be proven right, or shot to nothing. It got shot to nothing. And the man who arranged that, who had been in command of these particular soldiers for a matter of months, wore ivory grips on his revolvers, fined his own men for going without neckties in a combat zone, and held a theory about the American fighting man that ran precisely opposite to the German one. This is the story of what George Patton did about the idea that his army was a crowd of amateurs. Not a clever line across a table, something slower and a great deal more expensive for the people who had said it out loud. If you like watching arrogance walk straight into a wall it was warned about, this channel was built for you. Take a second to subscribe and switch on the bell, because the way this one turns is worth being here for. To understand why the German verdict felt so airtight in the summer of 1943, you have to go back to the winter and look at how badly the Americans had actually done, and how new to the whole business they truly were. The United States had been fighting the German army on the ground for a handful of months. American troops had come ashore in North Africa the previous November, in 3 large landings spread along the coast, and most of them had never heard a shot fired at them in anger. They had trained in Louisiana and the Carolinas and the California desert, and training is a rehearsal. Tunisia was opening night against the most experienced ground army on the planet. The Germans facing them had been at war since 1939. Many of the men in the Africa Corps had spent 2 years learning desert warfare against the British, an education no maneuver back home could match. The Americans arrived with new equipment, new commissions, and a confidence that had never once been tested by somebody shooting back. Then the test came, and it went about as badly as a first test can go. In February, the Germans swung a fist into the thin, overstretched southern end of the Allied line. American armor got fed into the fight in dribs and drabs. A battalion here, and a battalion there, and the Germans destroyed it in pieces. 2 American infantry battalions got left stranded on bare hills, and were swallowed almost to a man. A relief force of tanks was sent straight across open ground in full view of waiting German guns, and burned in the desert. Green troops met massed armor and dive bombers for the first time, and the experience was every bit as terrifying as the veterans had always promised it would be. The line came apart at the seams. By the time the German push ran out of fuel and squabbling generals pulled it back, the United States Army had lost thousands of men and hundreds of tanks, and it had done so in its very first serious meeting with the Wehrmacht. The Germans drew a lesson from that. The lesson they drew was the wrong one, and the wrongness of it is the whole hinge of everything that follows, so it is worth being exact about it. They concluded that the failure was a failure of the men. The American private, in their reading, simply lacked the hardness, the stubbornness, the plain willingness to stand and die in place that the German soldier had shown across 2 years of victories. It was a comfortable conclusion, because it flattered everything the German army already believed about itself, and because the doctrine handed down from the top told them their enemies were lesser peoples, who would crack the instant real pressure arrived. Kasserine looked like proof of both at once. It was not proof of either. The thing that broke in that first battle was not the courage of the man holding the rifle. It was everything stacked on top of him. The units scattered too thin across too much ground. The orders that arrived as riddles. the officers learning their trade in real time against people who had already mastered theirs. Fix all of that, and the same men become a different army entirely. But nobody on the German side seriously entertained that possibility, because their whole picture of the war told them the enemy's weakness lived in his blood and not in his circumstances. That was a soothing thing to believe. As a method of predicting your enemy, it was very close to suicidal, and the Germans were going to spend the rest of the war discovering exactly how close. There is an honest footnote here that most of the sneering left out at the time. Even inside the disaster, plenty of Americans had fought hard. Gun crews stayed at their pieces over open sights until they were overrun. Isolated pockets bought time for everyone behind them with their lives. The collapse was real, but it was a collapse of organization far more than a collapse of nerve. The particular kind that happens when brave men are committed in the wrong place, in the wrong strength, under a commander who cannot see the battle he is supposedly running. A German staff officer glancing at the wreckage saw cowards. A closer look would have shown him something far more dangerous. An enemy whose courage was already present and accounted for, and only needed organizing. Organizing it had become one man's job, and by the time the Americans came ashore in Sicily, that man had already turned the beaten corps around once. The Germans, busy admiring their verdict, had mostly failed to notice. The invasion of Sicily went in on the 10th of July 1943, and it was, at that point, the largest amphibious operation in the history of warfare. Larger by several measures than the landings in Normandy would be the following year. Two Allied armies came ashore side by side along the island's southern and eastern coasts. On the right, the British 8th Army under Bernard Montgomery, the most famous soldier in the British Empire, and a man whose caution and self-regard were as legendary as his competence. On the left, the United States 7th Army under George Patton. Over both of them sat Harold Alexander, the courtly British general who commanded the ground battle, and over him sat Dwight Eisenhower, running the whole Allied show from a headquarters far to the rear. The men waiting for them were not a single unified command, and that mattered more than it looked. The defense of Sicily belonged on paper to the Italian 6th Army, under General Alfredo Guzzoni, an aging officer who had arrived on the island only weeks before, and who commanded a patchwork of weak Italian coastal divisions, a couple of better Italian field divisions, and two strong German formations that took their real orders from Berlin whenever the mood suited them. Above the whole theater sat Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, the German commander in the south, a shrewd and relentlessly cheerful soldier who would spend the next 2 years making the Allies pay in blood for every mile of Italy. The pieces did not fit together well. The Germans did not fully trust the Italians to stand and fight. The Italians resented being treated as junior partners in the defense of their own soil. The lines of authority overlapped in ways no diagram could untangle. But on one point, the confident men in that structure were agreed. If the Allies came ashore, the answer was to hit the beachhead fast and hard with the German armor before it could set. And the green half of the invasion, the American half, was the soft place to hit. That was the whole plan. It was built directly on the verdict from Tunisia, and the verdict was about to be tested on the sand at Gela. And here the story runs into a wrinkle that had nothing to do with the Germans, and everything to do with what the Allies thought of each other. Alexander's plan for Sicily gave Montgomery the starring role. The 8th Army would drive straight up the east coast, on the direct road to Messina, the port in the island's northeast corner. That was the whole strategic point, because Messina sat across a narrow strait from the Italian mainland, and whoever held it, held the door the enemy had to use to escape. Patton's 7th Army was handed a supporting part. Guard Montgomery's flank. Cover the ground on the left. Protect the British as they won the campaign. Patton was, to put it gently, not delighted. He understood perfectly well what the plan implied. The Americans had performed poorly in their first outing. The British and their commanders had privately filed the United States Army, under promising but not yet serious. And the safe assumption in a lot of Allied headquarters was that you did not hand the decisive job to amateurs. The verdict from Kasserine had crossed the lines and settled comfortably among Patton's own allies. He would spend the Sicilian campaign fighting two arguments at once, one against the Germans in front of him, and one against the quiet condescension behind him. And there were days when it was genuinely hard to say which one made him angrier. The landings themselves were a rough, confused, and largely successful business. American paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne, jumping at night into high wind, were scattered so badly across the interior that some of them came down miles from anywhere they were supposed to be, which turned out to have an accidental benefit, because German commanders trying to piece together the situation from reports of American paratroopers turning up everywhere at once concluded the drop had been far larger than it was. On the beaches, Darby's Rangers took the town of Gela in a hard morning fight. The 1st Infantry Division, the big red one, under a lean and profane Texan named Terry de la Mesa Allen, came ashore in the center. Truscott's 3rd Division landed at Licata on the left, the 45th Division at Scogliti on the right. By the end of the first day, the 7th Army was ashore in strength, which was the good news. The bad news arrived the next morning, and it came in the shape of the Hermann Göring Panzer Division. The German plan for meeting an invasion of Sicily rested on speed and on the verdict. Speed, because a beachhead is never weaker than in its first day or two, before the guns and the tanks and the supplies have come across the water. And the verdict, because the German command was confident that a hard armored counterattack driven straight at green American troops would produce the same result it had produced at Kasserine. The men would break, the beachhead would fold, and the Mediterranean would swallow the whole enterprise. The division ordered to do it was the Hermann Göring, a strong armored formation, with a company of the heavy Tiger tanks among its panzers, and it was commanded by a general named Paul Conrath, who drove it toward the beaches, with exactly the confidence the verdict encouraged. The first blow actually landed on the afternoon of the 10th, the very day of the landings, when Italian infantry of the Livorno Division and a portion of the German armor pushed down toward Gela, while the Americans were still untangling themselves on the beach. Darby's Rangers and the scattered paratroopers who had come down near the town met it with everything within reach, called naval gunfire down onto the attacking columns, and threw the whole thing back with heavy Italian losses. It was a warning, and Conrath read it correctly, as a sign that he had not hit hard enough. So he spent the night pulling his division together for a proper concentrated stroke, and on the morning of the 11th he sent it in for real. The full weight of the Hermann Göring armor driving for the water in the flat expectation that this time, the green Americans would finally do the thing the verdict had promised for 4 months. On the 11th of July, that counterattack very nearly worked, and for a few hours the beach at Gela looked like Kasserine about to happen again. German armor came down the plain in strength. The dust rose in long brown banners over the coastal road, visible for miles before the tanks themselves ever crested the rise, so that men on the beach had time to watch the cloud grow before they had anything to shoot at. Italian troops of the Livorno Division pushed in alongside. Moving in the gaps the German armor opened, adding weight to a push that already had more weight than the beachhead was built to absorb. The pressure on the forward American positions was real and immediate, and a less steady defense would have started to peel backward right there, which is precisely what Conrath was counting on. The tanks ground closer to the water. Some of them got to within about 2,000 yards of the sea, close enough that the crews could see the landing craft, close enough that men on the beach could see the tanks, close enough that for a stretch of that morning, the invasion of Sicily had a real and specific chance of ending in the water rather than on the island. The verdict was, for a moment, standing on the edge of coming true. Then the ground the Germans were driving into began to kill them, and it did so for reasons the verdict had never troubled itself to consider. The first reason was that the Americans did not break. Terry Allen's 1st Division held its positions and its nerve. The infantry stayed in place and fought the tanks with everything they had, including the bazookas that were, in 1943, a brand new and only partly trusted way for a man on foot to kill an armored vehicle. Men who had never fired one outside of a training range now did it for the first time with a Tiger, 100 yards off, and some of those rounds bounced harmlessly, and some of them found a track or a drive sprocket and did enough to stop a machine that a rifle round never could. Darby's Rangers, holding in and around Gela, turned captured Italian artillery around and fired it at the advancing armor over open sights, which is to say they aimed the way a man aims a rifle, watching the shot land and correcting by eye, because there was no time and no equipment for anything more careful. Inland, at a low rise the maps called Piazza Ridge, a paratroop colonel named James Gavin scraped together a few hundred scattered airborne men, dropped in the wrong places the night before, and still finding their way to a fight by sound and rumor, and held the ridge against Hermann Göring infantry and armor, through a long and desperate afternoon with a single pack howitzer and a lot of stubbornness, and would not give it up even as the numbers in front of him kept growing worse. These were the amateurs. They were behaving like nothing of the kind. The second reason was sitting offshore, and it was the thing that finally broke the counterattack's back. The United States Navy had brought cruisers and destroyers close in to support the landings, and their gunners now went to work on the German armor, with a weight of fire no army in the desert had ever had to face. Naval guns firing from the sea are not artillery in the ordinary sense. They are heavier, and there are a lot of them, and when a spotter on the beach can see the tanks and radio the corrections, the effect on formations caught in the open is something close to annihilation. Cruisers stood off Gela and fired into Conrath's tanks until the neat armored spearhead came apart into confusion and wreckage. Tanks brewed up on the coastal plain, throwing columns of black smoke that mixed with the brown dust until the whole approach to the beach looked like a landscape on fire. Others turned around, their crews having decided, correctly, that whatever was coming down out of the sky in 6-inch shells was not a problem armor could solve by pushing forward into more of it. The Tigers, the heaviest thing the Germans had, discovered that being nearly impossible to knock out with a bazooka is not much comfort when a naval shell lands on you, or the ground you are standing on becomes untenable. By the end of the day, the counterattack had failed. The Hermann Göring Division, the instrument chosen to prove the verdict on the beaches of Sicily, had been stopped short of the sea, had lost a painful number of its tanks, and had been thrown back inland the way it had come, leaving burned hulks scattered across the plain as the only lasting mark of how close it had come to working. And somewhere in the middle of it, walking around on the beach at Gela while the shells were still landing, in full view of anybody who cared to look, was the commander of the 7th Army, who had come ashore into the crisis, rather than waiting for it to resolve itself on a headquarters map, and who was, in his own theatrical way, making a point about where the general belonged when the tanks were close. Soldiers who saw him that day remembered it for years afterward, not because he did anything a manual would have recommended, but because he was there at all, upright on an open beach under fire, in a uniform so polished it looked wrong next to the mud and the smoke. There is a piece of that same night that belongs in any honest telling, because it shows how raw and dangerous the whole business still was even inside a victory. With the beachhead holding but far from secure, the 7th Army ordered a second drop of paratroopers that night to reinforce the line, and the transport planes carrying them flew up the coast toward the drop zones in the dark, straight over the fleet, only hours after German aircraft had been bombing that same fleet. Nervous gunners on the ships and on the ground, keyed up for another air raid and unable to tell friend from enemy in a black sky, opened fire on their own aircraft. Planes full of American paratroopers were shot down into the sea and onto the land by American guns. Something on the order of 24 transports were lost, and scores of men died before a single one of them reached the ground to fight, burned or drowned or broken on the rocks below the drop zones they never got a chance to jump into. It was a catastrophe born of confusion and fear, and the plain impossibility of coordinating an operation that enormous without seams. And it is a useful corrective to anyone who pictures the Americans winning Sicily, because everything went smoothly. Almost nothing went smoothly. They won anyway, which is the more impressive fact, and the one the verdict never saw coming. The point mattered, and to see why, you have to understand what Patton had actually done to these soldiers in the months before Sicily, because it was the opposite of what the Germans assumed anyone could do. George Smith Patton was 57 years old, and had spent his entire adult life getting ready for a war he had privately feared he might miss. He came from money, and from a family soaked in soldiering, and he grew up hearing stories of ancestors who had fought and, in his own telling, of past lives he himself had lived on other battlefields centuries before. He had fenced and shot and ridden at the Stockholm Olympics in 1912, finishing respectably in an event that tested exactly the skills a 19th century officer would have needed, and that had almost nothing to do with the war he would eventually fight. He had chased a Mexican revolutionary across the border, and come back with bodies strapped to the hoods of his cars, which tells you a fair amount about the man at 30, and about the appetite for personal risk that never left him. In the First World War, he had built and led the 1st American Tank Brigade, and been shot through the leg, going forward on foot with them, refusing to be carried off the field until he had seen the attack through to a point he judged acceptable. Between the wars, when the tank was an unfashionable idea, and a lot of senior officers still thought cavalry meant horses, Patton kept thinking about armor and speed and shock, writing papers that mostly went unread, and keeping his own counsel about a kind of warfare the army was not yet ready to fight. He also built a public personality so loud and so deliberately abrasive that it was easy to file him under blowhard. And plenty of people did, then and since. That was a mistake. Underneath the profanity and the ivory grips was one of the most serious students of war the American army produced in the entire 20th century. A man who read history in several languages, who kept notebooks full of quotations from Caesar and Napoleon, and who had concluded, with total conviction, that battles are won in the minds of soldiers before they are ever won on the ground. When he had taken over the beaten corps in Tunisia that spring, he acted on that conviction at once and without a shred of mercy. The first thing the soldiers noticed about their new commander was that he cared, intensely and personally, about their neckties. This sounds like a joke, and the men certainly received it as one. But Patton was in dead earnest. He ordered that every soldier at all times, in the rear and up near the front, would wear a helmet, a necktie, leggings, and a complete uniform. And he set fines for violations. And then he actually collected the fines, which was the part nobody could believe. Cooks got fined. Truck drivers got fined. Men coming off the line filthy and hollow-eyed found inspectors, checking whether their chin straps were fastened, and some of them were sent back to their tents to correct the fault before they were allowed to eat. The grumbling was immediate and entirely fair, because being docked pay over a missing necktie feels like an insult laid carefully on top of an injury, especially to men who had just watched friends die and did not see how a strip of cloth around the neck was going to change that. Patton did not care in the slightest that they hated it, because the necktie was never about the necktie. He understood something about beaten troops, that their previous commander, running the corps from a headquarters well behind the front, had never grasped. A beaten army stops believing in itself, and a soldier who has stopped believing stops doing the small, hard, unglamorous things that keep him breathing. Digging the hole deep enough, posting the guard, obeying the order in the first second rather than the fatal third. Patton's theory was that you rebuild belief from the outside in. You make a man look like a soldier, and act like a soldier, and submit to the discipline of a soldier. And somewhere in that grinding daily process he starts, almost against his will, to feel like one again. The neckties and the fines and the inspections were 1,000 tiny demands, adding up to a single message, repeated every hour of every day. You are not a defeated rabble. You are a corps of the United States Army, and you will start carrying yourselves that way whether you feel like it or not. It was, in its way, a piece of applied psychology, dressed up as a uniform regulation, and it worked precisely because it never let up long enough for a man to talk himself out of it. Behind the show there was hard substance, which is the part the neckties tend to hide. Patton had gone through the officer corps and removed the men he judged unfit, swapping tired or timid commanders for people who would push, sometimes over the objections of officers senior to the men he was replacing them with. He had pulled the units back into proper concentration, instead of leaving them strewn across the map for the enemy to pick off one at a time, undoing weeks of dispersal in a matter of days. He had seen to hot food and regular mail, and the small reliable comforts that tell a man somebody competent is running his life now, understanding that morale is built as much in the mess line as on the parade ground. And within weeks, the change was visible to everyone who saw it. And eventually, that included the Germans, who met a rebuilt American defense at a place called El Guetar in March, and got a veteran Panzer Division shot to pieces in front of it for their trouble. The same division that a few months earlier had helped hand the Americans their worst defeat of the war in the desert. He was not doing any of it alone, and the story shortchanges the other men, if it makes Patton the only adult in the room. His principal subordinate in Sicily was a quiet, plain-spoken general named Omar Bradley, who ran the American Corps doing much of the hard infantry fighting, and who was Patton's opposite in nearly every way that showed. Where Patton was performance and fire, Bradley was arithmetic, careful and methodical, and trusted by the soldiers precisely because he never once tried to dazzle them, walking the line in a plain field jacket, while Patton rode past in a car with sirens. The two men did not especially like each other, and the friction between them, most of it running from Bradley toward Patton, would turn genuinely bitter in the years ahead. surfacing in memoirs written long after the war was over. But in Sicily, they made an effective pairing, with Patton supplying the drive and the fear, and Bradley supplying the steady competence that turned the drive into something a plan could survive. Under them served men like Terry Allen at the 1st Division, and Lucian Truscott at the 3rd. Hard professional soldiers who had learned their trade the same brutal way the enlisted men had. In North Africa, at a cost neither of them ever spoke about lightly. This was the officer corps Patton had spent the spring rebuilding, promoting the pushers and removing the timid. It is the part of the achievement that the neckties and the ivory revolvers tend to hide. The theater remembered the pistols. The Germans at Gela met the officer corps. So the soldiers standing on the beach at Gela in July were not the men who had run in February. They had been beaten once, told in 100 ways, by fine and by inspection, and by a commander who would not let the subject drop, that they were not good enough, and then handed back the belief that they were a real army, and then they had proven it with bazookas and captured guns and a single howitzer on a ridge that would not fall. The Germans driving toward the water at Gela were relying on a verdict that was already 4 months out of date, built on a battle fought by a different army under different commanders, and nobody had bothered to tell them the case had been closed and reopened since. They found out on the beach, in the smoke, watching their tanks burn one after another, while the men they had expected to run instead stood and loaded another round. Preparing and narrating a story like this one takes real time. So if you are enjoying it, do us a favor and tap the like button, and while you are down there, leave a comment telling us where in the world you are watching from. It genuinely helps these longer pieces reach the people who care about them. Now, back to Sicily. Holding the beach was one thing. What Patton did next was the actual reply to the idea that his army was a supporting act, and it did not come out of his mouth. It came out of a map. The campaign, as Alexander had designed it, was supposed to be Montgomery's show. The 8th Army would roll up the east coast to Messina, while the Americans watched the flank, screening the advance and mopping up whatever the British pushed past. It was, on paper, a sensible division of labor between a proven army and an untested one, and nobody at headquarters saw any reason to argue with it in the planning stage. But the plan ran into a stubborn fact almost at once, which was that the Germans were not idiots, and had put their strength exactly where the plan said the decisive blow would fall. Montgomery's advance up the east coast slammed into hard German defense on the plain in front of Catania, including German paratroopers who fought for a bridge over a river, with a ferocity that had nothing amateur about it on either side, and the great British drive to Messina slowed to a crawl, and then very nearly stopped, bogged down in front of positions that the planners had assumed would already be behind the advance by then. While Montgomery was stuck, Patton was standing on the left with the fastest and most aggressive army in the theater, and orders that amounted to please stay out of the way. He found this intolerable, which was the correct reaction, and he set about changing it. He flew to see Alexander, and, in a conversation that has been retold many ways, extracted permission to push his army harder to the northwest, ostensibly as a reconnaissance in force, which is the sort of modest phrase a general uses when he intends to do something enormous and does not want to ask permission for the whole of it in advance. Reconnaissance in force turned into a breakout. Patton organized a fast provisional corps under his deputy Geoffrey Keyes, and turned it loose across the western half of the island. And within days, it was clear to everyone at Alexander's headquarters that whatever this operation had been called on paper, it was now a full offensive with a destination. There was a reason the West fell as fast as it did, and it was not only American speed. Guzzoni and the German command had looked at the same map and made a cold decision. Western Sicily could not be held and was not worth dying for, so the plan became to give it up, fall back into the mountainous northeastern corner of the island around the great volcano of Mount Etna, and hold a short, strong line there covering Messina and the road to the mainland. The good mobile units were pulled east to build that line, leaving the west to a scattering of Italian garrisons with little equipment and less will to fight for towns their own high command had already written off. What Patton's provisional corps raced through on the way to Palermo was, in large part, ground the enemy had already chosen to abandon. That takes nothing away from the pace, which was genuinely stunning, and which no one on either side had believed the Americans could manage. Columns covering in a day distances that staff planners had budgeted a week for. But it explains why the drive west met so little that could stop it. And it sets up the harder fight waiting on the far side. Because the moment Patton turned east toward Messina, he was no longer chasing a collapse. He was attacking the strongest ground on the island, held by Germans who had finally stopped underestimating the men in front of them. What followed was vintage Patton, and it was the opposite of everything the verdict predicted. The Provisional Corps covered ground at a pace that startled everyone, including the people it belonged to, trucks and half-tracks running through the night with headlights blazing, because Patton had decided that speed mattered more than caution, and was willing to accept the risk himself. Towns that expected months more of war were liberated in an afternoon by American columns that did not stop to celebrate, waving crowds left behind in the dust before the last vehicle had even cleared the square. The Italian defense in the west, which had little appetite left for a lost cause, largely melted, whole garrisons surrendering to advance parties of a few dozen men, and the Americans drove through the collapse, rather than pausing to be careful about it. On the 22nd of July, roughly 12 days after coming ashore as the junior partner, Patton's 7th Army took Palermo, the largest city in Sicily, and the capital of the West, and Patton walked into it with the theatrical satisfaction of a man who had just answered an insult without saying a word. And while Patton's columns were rolling into Palermo, something far larger than a captured city was coming apart on the mainland, and the invasion of Sicily was the thing that had cracked it. The loss of the island, the first piece of the Italian homeland to fall, was more than the fascist state could survive. On the 25th of July, 3 days after Palermo, the Grand Council of the Fascist Party turned on Benito Mussolini, and the King of Italy, seizing the opening, had the man who had ruled the country for more than 20 years, arrested and driven away in an ambulance. A small and almost comically undramatic end for a regime that had staged so much theater over 2 decades. The dictator who had marched Italy into the war was finished, brought down in the middle of a campaign still being fought over the very ground his propaganda had sworn to defend. The new Italian government would spend the following weeks secretly trying to change sides, sending envoys through neutral countries to feel out terms with the Allies. And before the autumn was out, Italy would quit the war on the Axis side, and the Germans would be occupying their former ally at gunpoint. The soldiers grinding along the Sicilian coast knew almost none of this yet. Word would reach the front in fragments, through wireless bulletins and rumor, days after the fact. But the invasion they were fighting had already reached up off the battlefield and pulled down a government, which is a fair measure of how much the amateurs' campaign actually counted for. Then he pointed the whole army east along the north coast, and began to race Montgomery to Messina in earnest. The race gets remembered as a stunt, and there was certainly a large amount of Patton's personal vanity wrapped up in it, because he wanted very badly to beat the most famous general in the British Army to the prize, and to rub the Americans' arrival in the faces of everyone who had doubted them. He said as much to his staff more than once, in language too blunt to have survived intact in most of the official histories. But it was also a genuinely hard piece of soldiering, because the north coast of Sicily is a nightmare to attack along. The mountains come almost down to the sea. The road runs on a narrow shelf between the high ground and the water, and a small number of determined defenders blowing bridges and holding ridgelines can slow a large army to a walk, since there is rarely room to go around a blown bridge, and no choice but to clear the high ground covering it first. The Germans, now under commanders who had stopped underestimating anybody and were running a skillful fighting withdrawal toward the strait, made the Americans pay for every mile, mining the road, dropping bridges behind them, and leaving rear guards on every defensible height. So Patton did what Patton did. He refused to be slowed to the enemy's pace, and he used the sea. Truscott's 3rd Division led the drive along the coast, and when a German position on a ridge threatened to hold the whole advance up, Patton had a battalion loaded onto landing craft and put ashore behind the German line to cut the coast road and trap the defenders. He did it more than once, treating the small naval flotilla assigned to the 7th Army as a private shuttle service for turning the flanks that the mountains made impossible to turn on foot. One of these landings, at a place called Brolo in the middle of August, put an American battalion under a colonel named Lyle Bernard onto a hill deep behind the German front, where it spent a brutal day and night surrounded and shot at from all sides, cut off from resupply and taking fire from German artillery that had been repositioned to hit the very hill Bernard's men had just seized, before the main force fought through to it. The end runs were costly, and some of them were closer to disaster than triumph. Because dropping a battalion behind an intact enemy is a fine way to lose a battalion, and Bernard's men came within a hard afternoon of exactly that fate. But they kept the Germans from ever settling into a line they could hold, and they kept the 7th Army moving when the terrain said it should have stopped, forcing the defenders to abandon one prepared position after another before they had finished digging in. Montgomery, meanwhile, had finally broken the deadlock in front of Catania and was coming up the east coast at his own steady pace, and the two armies converged on Messina from opposite directions, with the Germans withdrawing between them, in a fighting retreat that was, by any honest measure, one of the more skillful operations either side conducted on the island. German engineers blew every bridge and stretch of coastal road worth blowing as they pulled back, and ferried tens of thousands of their own troops across the narrow strait to the mainland almost intact, under flak so dense that Allied aircraft trying to interdict the crossing took losses out of proportion to what they sank. It was, in its own way, as impressive a piece of soldiering as anything the Americans had done getting to Palermo, and it meant that the prize waiting at the end of the race would turn out to be an empty city rather than a trapped army. Patton's forward elements reached Messina on the 16th of August, a matter of hours ahead of the first British patrols, and he made sure everyone who mattered knew it. He accepted the surrender of the city with the same theatrical flair he had brought to Palermo, and photographs of him standing triumphant in the rubble went around the world within days. The race had been won, and Patton had gotten precisely the newspaper moment he wanted. But the war going on to Patton's north had already moved out from under him, onto the mainland he could see across the strait, and the army he had spent months rebuilding out of the wreckage in Tunisia would carry that same argument, that Americans could fight, into Italy, and beyond it, long after Messina itself had stopped being anyone's headline. On the 17th of August, 1943, American troops of Patton's 7th Army entered Messina, just ahead of the British patrols coming up from the south. The junior partner, the supporting act, the army of amateurs, had crossed the entire island, taken its capital, fought along its worst coastline, and reached the strategic prize first. The campaign that Alexander's plan had handed to Montgomery had been won, in its most visible and public sense, by the Americans, and the German verdict that had driven a panzer division at the Gela beaches in the confident expectation of a rout had precisely nothing left to say. The argument was over. The people who had made it were now busy trying to get off the island. And this is where an honest history has to slow down and refuse to hand you a clean statue, because the same campaign that vindicated the American soldier also contained two things the legend prefers to skip, and leaving them out would be the kind of flattering lie the Germans told themselves. The first is strategic, and it is the reason Messina was worth racing for in the first place. While the Allies were congratulating themselves on the coming victory, the Germans were doing something extremely professional and extremely inconvenient. Across the strait in the campaign's final week, in an operation the Germans ran with real skill, they evacuated the bulk of their forces on the island back to the Italian mainland. Roughly 100,000 Axis troops, the larger share of them Italian, and a very hard core of them the German veterans who would have to be beaten all over again, crossed the water to Calabria, along with thousands of vehicles and guns, and they did it under the noses of an Allied air and naval superiority that never managed to close the door. The Allies took Sicily. They did not trap the army that had been defending it. The race to Messina was, in one bleak sense, a race to an empty finish line, because the men the prize was supposed to bag had already walked out the back. Patton reached the port first. The garrison he was supposed to catch was mostly gone. Both of those things are true at the same time. And the campaign is not honestly told with only the first one. The second thing is personal, and it goes straight to the heart of the courage this whole story is about, because it is the moment Patton failed the exact test he had spent his career understanding better than anyone. In Sicily, in the August of that year, moving between field hospitals behind the front, Patton came across two soldiers on two separate days, about a week apart, who had been taken off the line, not with visible wounds, but with what the war then called battle fatigue, and what we would now recognize as the psychological collapse that hard combat produces in ordinary men. Patton, whose entire creed was built on aggression and will, looked at these two shaking soldiers and saw cowards. He cursed them. He called them names in front of the doctors and the wounded, and in each case he struck them, slapping men who were patients lying in hospital tents, one of whom, it later came out, was burning with fever from a real illness. The man who had understood so clearly in Tunisia that the failure of a beaten army is the fault of its leadership, who had rebuilt a broken core on exactly that insight, had just failed completely to extend the same understanding to two of his own soldiers when it was hardest to give. The irony is total, and it is not the kind that makes you smile. Combat fatigue is not a moral failing, and it is not cowardice. It is what happens to an ordinary human nervous system, held too long under a strain it was never built to carry, and it strikes the brave and the frightened alike, very often the ones who have already endured the most. Patton, who prided himself on reading soldiers better than anyone alive, had run face first into the limit of his own theory. He could see with perfect clarity that a beaten army's collapse was the failure of its generals. He could not, standing in that tent, see that the collapse of a single shaking man in front of him might be no failure at all. It was the same closed door the Germans had, only pointed in a different direction, and it very nearly ended him. When word reached Eisenhower, he was furious, and Patton was made to apologize to the men, to the medical staff, and to representatives of his troops. And when the story reached the American public some months later through a newspaper columnist, the uproar nearly stripped him of his command for good. The most aggressive battlefield commander the Americans had spent the better part of the following year sidelined, kept around in part because he was useful as a famous name the Germans could be encouraged to worry about, while the real plans formed elsewhere. The campaign had its uglier moments lower down the chain of command too, and a channel that refuses to flatter the enemy should not flatter its own side either. In the fighting around one of the island's airfields in the first days, American soldiers in more than one incident shot Italian and German prisoners who had already surrendered, killings serious enough to bring courts-martial afterward, and they sit as a permanent stain across an otherwise proud few weeks. War does that to men, all men, and no uniform exempts anyone from it. None of that changes the answer to the question this story is about. It only refuses to pretend the answer arrived clean, without cost and without sin, because it did not, and the version that pretends otherwise is the same kind of comfortable lie the Germans told themselves about their own conduct. Hold both of those. He was a genuinely great battlefield commander and a genuinely flawed man, in the same body, at the same time, and any version of him that sands one of those truths away to make the other shine is selling you a cartoon instead of a person. But on the single question this story has been circling from the beginning, the question of whether his army was a crowd of amateurs who would fold when the fighting got close, the record is not complicated at all. Gela answered it. The road to Messina answered it again, and the men who had said otherwise were the ones left with nothing. Because that was always the real lesson, and it reaches a very long way past one island in the Mediterranean. The German verdict did not fail because the German army was weak. It was anything but weak, and it would go on killing with terrible efficiency for 2 more years. The verdict failed because the German mind was closed. They had looked at a beaten, badly led, green enemy in one bad winter, and read a permanent truth about that enemy's character, when all they were actually looking at was one bad season and one very bad general. They confused a single moment for a final judgment, and they built their plans on the confusion, and then they sent a panzer division to the beaches at Gela to act on it, and watched it burn short of the water. That was the hidden flaw wired into the whole machine, and it was worse than any shortage of tanks or fuel. An army that has told itself the enemy is inferior by birth has disabled its own ability to learn. Every surprise gets explained away. Every enemy success becomes a fluke, an accident of numbers, a thing that will surely correct itself next time. The German command did exactly this with the Americans, deciding that El Guitar had been bad luck, and that Gela was some combination of naval gunfire and misfortune rather than a signal. And it did the same thing on a vastly larger and more fatal scale in the East, where the conviction that they were fighting subhuman opponents helped march them into a war that swallowed their army whole. Contempt feels like strength from the inside. It reads as confidence, as clarity, as hard-headed realism. In practice, it is one of the most expensive things a military can allow itself to feel, because it blinds you to precisely the information you most need in order to survive. There is a harder truth underneath that one, and a channel that wants to be trusted ought to say it plainly rather than leave you comfortable. The most respected German commander of the Desert War had actually seen the danger clearly, back in Tunisia, before he was recalled. His private assessment of the Americans was far more careful and far more alarming to his own side than the easy contempt floating around the German staff, because he had noticed the one thing that mattered. The Americans learned with frightening speed. The British had taken years to become the army that mastered the desert. The Americans were compressing that same brutal education into months, and behind them sat a bottomless capacity to replace every tank and gun and man they lost, and then send more. An enemy who learns that fast and produces that much is not an enemy you beat by assuming he is a coward. He is an enemy you had better start taking with deadly seriousness while there is still time. The warning existed inside the German command. It was simply more pleasant to ignore it, and so they ignored it. And Gela was one of the places the bill came due. Patton's real advantage over the men who wrote off his soldiers was never that he was kinder than they were. The hospital tents in Sicily prove he was not. His advantage was that, on this one subject, he was paying attention, and they had decided they no longer needed to. He looked at the same beaten, written-off soldiers the Germans had dismissed, and instead of a permanent truth about their character, he saw an army that had simply never been handed a reason to believe in itself. So he spent a few weeks and an unreasonable quantity of neckties handing them that reason, and then he pointed them across the largest island in the Mediterranean and drove them to the far side of it faster than anyone thought the terrain would allow. The rifles were the same. The men were the same. The only thing that changed was the quality of the mind in command, and that one change ran a Panzer Division into the sea and put an American flag in Messina. The reply that began on the beach at Gela did not end in Sicily. The same army the Germans had filed under amateurs would come ashore in France the following summer, and after the breakout from the hedgerows, Patton would take command of an army and drive it across the country at a pace that alarmed his own superiors, nearly as much as it terrified the enemy. The men who could not fight, in the German telling of early 1943, became the spearhead of the force that broke into Germany itself. Every mile of that was written in the same hand as Gela. Take ordinary men, give them leadership worth following, and the belief that they are already good enough, and then have the sense to get out of the way of what they become. The Germans had built an entire war on the opposite idea, that their enemies were lesser by birth, and would fold on contact. And that idea felt like hard-headed realism, right up until the morning it drove a Panzer Division into the sea, off a Sicilian beach, and then kept on costing them, month after month, until there was nothing left to spend. If you made it all the way to the end of this one, you are exactly the kind of person this channel is for. So thank you for being here. Tell us in the comments whether you think it was Patton's discipline that turned his army into the thing that stopped Conrath at the beaches, or whether the real credit belongs to the sailors on the cruisers and the paratroopers on Piazza Ridge and the infantry who stood in front of the tanks with bazookas. If you got something out of the story, the like and the subscribe genuinely do help us keep making these. And there are a great many more on the way. We will see you in the next one.